Let's start by talking about something that many people struggle to put into words. When you're in a relationship with a narcissistic partner, especially behind closed doors, you may feel confused about the sexual dynamic. On the surface, it may look passionate. It may even feel intense, magnetic, consuming. But if you slow it down and really examine it, something feels off. And what's off is this. For a narcissist, sex is not about intimacy. It's about power. Healthy sexuality is rooted in connection. It's about mutual vulnerability, shared pleasure, emotional safety, and trust. It's about feeling seen and accepted. But narcissism does not operate from a place of mutuality. It operates from a place of hierarchy. Someone has to be on top. Someone has to win. Someone has to dominate emotionally, psychologically, sometimes even physically. And sex becomes one of the most efficient arenas in which that power can be asserted. In the early stages of the relationship, this power dynamic can be hard to detect because it's wrapped in intensity. The narcissistic partner may be highly attentive. They may seem confident, passionate, adventurous. You might interpret that as chemistry. You might tell yourself, I've never felt this desired before. And that feeling of being intensely wanted can be intoxicating. But look carefully at the pattern. Is it about mutual discovery, or is it about them proving something? For many narcissistic individuals, sex is performance, it's validation, it's conquest, it's reassurance that they are desirable, superior, irresistible. It is not a shared emotional experience. It's an ego transaction. And when sex becomes an ego transaction, your role shifts. You are no longer a partner. You are a mirror. Your admiration, your response, your desire becomes fuel for their self-image. And here's where the power dynamic deepens. Because when sex is about power, it also becomes about control. Control over when it happens. Control over how it happens. Control over your access to it. You may notice that intimacy occurs on their terms, their timing, their mood, their needs. If they want it, it happens. If they withdraw, it disappears. There's very little consistency because consistency would imply equality, and equality threatens the narcissistic system. You may start to feel anxious. You may start wondering, did I do something wrong? When the sexual dynamic shifts. That anxiety is not accidental. Power thrives on unpredictability. When someone controls access to affection and intimacy, they control the emotional climate of the relationship. And when you are constantly trying to recalibrate yourself to get back to the closeness you once had, you are no longer operating from agency. You're operating from survival. Another subtle but powerful element of this dynamic is objectification. When sex is about power, the other person becomes an object rather than a subject. An object to gratify, an object to display, an object to validate. Your emotional world, your comfort, your desires, those are secondary. Sometimes they are completely irrelevant, and yet, because the sexual intensity can be so strong, it's easy to mistake that intensity for intimacy. Intensity is not intimacy. Intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is terrifying for a narcissistic personality structure. To be vulnerable would mean to risk inadequacy, to risk rejection, to risk being seen as flawed. So instead, they lean into control. They lean into dominance. They lean into performance. Power feels safer than closeness. And here's something important to understand. This dynamic doesn't always look aggressive. It can be subtle. It can be charming. It can even feel empowering at first. You may feel chosen, desired, special. But over time, you begin to notice that the emotional depth never quite materializes. Conversations don't deepen. Empathy doesn't expand. After intimacy, instead of feeling bonded, you may feel strangely alone. That loneliness is information. When sex is rooted in connection, it builds trust. When it's rooted in power, it builds imbalance. And imbalance eventually erodes self-worth. You might start trying harder, looking different, acting different, initiating more, withdrawing more, all in an effort to stabilize something that was never about mutuality to begin with. So if you find yourself in a dynamic where sexuality feels like a tool, a reward, a punishment, a bargaining chip, pause, step back. Ask yourself not how intense it is, not how passionate it is, but how safe it feels. Ask yourself whether you feel equal. Ask yourself whether your needs matter as much as theirs, because real intimacy doesn't require you to shrink, perform, or compete. When sex becomes a battlefield for power, love cannot survive there. And that's the truth hiding behind closed doors. Now, once you understand that sex in a narcissistic dynamic is often about power rather than intimacy, the next piece starts to make a lot more sense. And that's the overwhelming intensity at the beginning, the kind that feels almost cinematic, the kind where you say to yourself, I've never experienced anything like this. This is where love bombing shows up, and it often shows up through sexuality. In the early stage, the narcissistic partner may come on strong, very strong. The chemistry feels explosive. The attraction feels immediate. The sexual connection may feel adventurous, passionate, constant. You may feel pursued in a way that feels flattering and intoxicating. They want you all the time. They text you constantly. They compliment your body, your energy, your desirability. It can feel like you've stepped into a romance novel. But here's what's really happening underneath that intensity. Love bombing through sexuality is not about bonding. It's about hooking. It's about creating a surge of emotional and physiological attachment so powerful that you bypass your own caution. Sexual intensity releases dopamine, oxytocin, adrenaline, the very chemicals that bond us to another human being. When that intensity is consistent and overwhelming at the beginning, it accelerates attachment. You feel close before trust has actually been built. You feel chosen before you've truly been known. And that's the strategy. Because when someone bonds you quickly through passion, they create investment. You start imagining a future. You start idealizing them. You start overlooking small red flags because the connection feels too good to question. You might even tell friends, I know it's fast, but it just feels right. Fast and intense can feel like fate, but often it's a setup. What makes this particularly confusing is that the narcissistic partner may seem incredibly attentive during this phase. They may study what you like. They may present themselves as open, experimental, deeply attracted. They mirror your desires. They make you feel uniquely special, as though no one else has ever affected them this way. And that mirroring creates a powerful illusion of compatibility. But mirroring is not the same as authenticity. The goal of sexual love bombing isn't closeness. It's control through attachment. Once you are emotionally and physically bonded, your nervous system begins to crave that person. You associate them with pleasure, validation, excitement. And when the dynamic eventually shifts, and it will, you're not just losing a partner, you're losing a chemical high. That's why the withdrawal feels so devastating. Because what follows love bombing is almost always a change. The intensity decreases. The availability becomes inconsistent. The passion that once felt constant now feels conditional. You might notice they are suddenly distracted, critical, distant, and you find yourself chasing the version of them you met in the beginning. But here's the painful truth. The beginning wasn't the stable version. It was the performance. Love bombing through sexuality works because it creates contrast. When someone gives you 100% intensity and then pulls back to 30%, you don't evaluate the 30% objectively. You compare it to the high, and you work harder to get back there. You may initiate more. You may tolerate more. You may silence your discomfort because you remember how incredible it once felt. And this is where trauma bonding quietly takes root. The brain becomes conditioned to associate unpredictability with reward. When the narcissistic partner occasionally returns to that early intensity, or even briefly, it reinforces hope. See, it's still there. We just need to get back to that place. But that place was never about stability. It was about securing your attachment. Healthy intimacy builds gradually. It deepens over time. It doesn't overwhelm your nervous system. It doesn't feel like a tidal wave. It feels steady, warm, reciprocal. It allows space for emotional safety to grow alongside physical closeness. Love bombing feels urgent. It feels consuming. It often moves faster than emotional reality can sustain. And when sexuality is used as the primary vehicle for love bombing, it creates a particularly powerful illusion. Because sexual vulnerability feels like emotional vulnerability, sharing bodies can feel like sharing souls. But if the emotional depth isn't there, if empathy, accountability, and consistency aren't there, then what you're experiencing is not intimacy, it's stimulation. And stimulation fades. The tragedy is that many people internalize the shift. When the intensity drops, they assume they are no longer desirable. They question their body, their performance, their worth. But the change was never about you. It was about the narcissistic cycle moving into its next phase. So if you look back and realize that the beginning felt almost too good, too fast, too consuming, trust that instinct. Real connection doesn't need to overwhelm you to keep you. It doesn't need to flood you with intensity to secure your loyalty. When passion is used as bait, it's not romance, it's recruitment. And anything built on recruitment instead of reciprocity will eventually reveal its cost. Now, after the love bombing fades, after the intensity settles and the pattern starts to reveal itself, something even more confusing begins to surface. On the outside, the sexual relationship may still look active. It may still look passionate. There may still be chemistry, but emotionally, something is missing. And what's missing is vulnerability. This is where we need to separate two things that often get tangled together: physical intimacy and emotional intimacy. They are not the same. They can overlap in healthy relationships, but they are not interchangeable. And in a narcissistic dynamic, they are often completely disconnected. A narcissistic partner may appear sexually confident. They may seem adventurous, skilled, even attentive in certain moments. They may know exactly what to say. They may present themselves as open-minded or uninhibited. But when it comes to emotional exposure, real exposure, you hit a wall. Because vulnerability requires equality. Vulnerability means saying, "This is what I feel." It means admitting fear, insecurity, longing, shame. It means letting someone see you without the armor. And for someone organized around narcissism, that kind of exposure feels dangerous. If their identity is built on superiority, control, and image, then revealing emotional fragility threatens the entire structure. So what do they do instead? They keep intimacy physical. See, sex becomes an activity rather than a connection. It becomes something you do, not something you share. Afterward, you may notice there's no deep conversation, no lingering emotional presence, no sense of closeness that carries into the next day. You might lie next to them and feel strangely alone. That loneliness is not your imagination. You may try to deepen things. You may open up emotionally. You may say, "I want to feel closer to you," or "Can we talk about what this means for us?" And instead of meeting you in that space, they deflect, they joke, they minimize. They may even accuse you of being too emotional or too intense. The very act of asking for emotional intimacy becomes framed as a problem, and this is how the imbalance solidifies. Because over time, you start lowering your expectations. You tell yourself, maybe I'm asking for too much. You convince yourself that physical closeness should be enough. But your nervous system knows the difference. Your body knows when something is missing. True intimacy creates safety. It makes you feel calmer, more grounded, more secure. Performative intimacy creates stimulation without security. It gives you the physical closeness, but withholds the emotional anchor. And let's talk about performance for a moment. For many narcissistic individuals, sex is still about image, even in long-term relationships. They want to be seen as desirable, skilled, dominant, irresistible. They may be very focused on how they are perceived during intimacy. They may seek praise, validation, reassurance, but they rarely pause to ask, "What are you feeling right now?" Not in a deep, sustained way. Empathy is limited. Curiosity about your inner world is limited. The focus returns again and again to them. You may also notice that emotional conversations outside the bedroom feel disconnected from what happens inside it. There's no integration, no growth, no deepening. It can start to feel compartmentalized, as though the physical relationship exists in one box and the emotional relationship, thin as it may be, exists in another. Healthy intimacy blends those worlds. It allows physical closeness to deepen emotional trust, and emotional trust to enrich physical closeness. But in a narcissistic system, integration is difficult because integration requires authenticity, and authenticity requires self-awareness. Without self-awareness, there's no real accountability. Without accountability, there's no real growth. So the relationship hovers at a surface level, even if the surface feels passionate. Over time, this creates a subtle erosion of self, because you begin to question your own needs. You might think, why do I still feel disconnected? We're intimate, we're close physically, but your emotional needs remain unmet, and unmet needs don't disappear, they accumulate. You may feel unseen, unheard, interchangeable. And that's one of the most painful parts, because intimacy is supposed to make you feel known. It's supposed to make you feel chosen, not just for your body, but for your mind, your fears, your history, your dreams. When someone consistently avoids that depth, it sends a message, even if it's never spoken. The message is, I will share your body, but I will not share myself. And that creates a quiet grief, a grief for the closeness you thought you had, a grief for the vulnerability that never arrived, a grief for the emotional partnership that always felt just out of reach. So if you find yourself in a relationship where sex exists, but emotional safety does not, pay attention. If you feel exposed physically but unsupported emotionally, pay attention. If you open your heart and are met with distance instead of depth, pay attention, because real intimacy is not just about access to someone's body. It's about access to their truth. And if their truth is always hidden behind performance, then what you're sharing is proximity, not connection. And once you've experienced the intensity, once you've felt the passion and then the emotional distance, there's another shift that can feel even more destabilizing. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's quiet, it's subtle, and it's incredibly powerful. That's when intimacy starts being withheld. Now, let's be very clear about something. In any healthy relationship, sexual desire can fluctuate. Stress happens, fatigue happens, life happens. That's normal. What we're talking about here is not normal fluctuation. We're talking about strategic withdrawal. We're talking about intimacy being used as leverage. When sex has already been established as a place of power in the relationship, withholding it becomes one of the most effective tools of control. It often begins after conflict. You express a concern, you set a boundary, you question something that doesn't feel right, and instead of engaging in the conversation in a healthy way, the narcissistic partner shifts the terrain. Suddenly they're distant, cold, unavailable. Physical affection decreases. Touch disappears. Eye contact softens into indifference. Nothing is said directly. There's no open conversation about what's happening, but you feel it. And that's the point. Because when intimacy is withdrawn without explanation, it creates anxiety. You start scanning for what you did wrong. You replay conversations in your head. You wonder if you were too critical, too demanding, too sensitive. The focus shifts away from the original issue and onto regaining connection. And now the power has flipped back to them. Withholding intimacy works because human beings are wired for connection. Physical closeness regulates our nervous system. It reassures us. So when it disappears suddenly, especially after a period of intensity, it feels destabilizing. It feels like rejection. And rejection triggers fear. That fear often leads to compliance. You may soften your stance. You may apologize even if you're not sure what you're apologizing for. You may stop bringing up concerns altogether because you've learned, consciously or unconsciously, that asserting yourself results in distance. And that distance hurts. Over time, this creates conditioning. Your brain begins to associate self-expression with loss of intimacy. So you silence yourself. You shrink. You become easier to manage. And the narcissistic system remains intact. Sometimes the withholding isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about maintaining mystery and superiority. If they control access to intimacy, they control your sense of security. You never quite know where you stand. And uncertainty keeps you invested. You try harder. You analyze more. You become hyper-attuned to their moods. That hyper-attunement is not love. It's survival. There's also another layer to this dynamic. In some cases, the narcissistic partner may openly blame you for the lack of intimacy. They may say you're not attractive enough, not exciting enough, not attentive enough. They rewrite the narrative so that their withdrawal becomes your deficiency. And now you're not only anxious, you're insecure. You may begin to question your body, your desirability, your worth. The same person who once flooded you with passion now withholds it and implies you're the problem. That psychological whiplash creates deep confusion. But let's name it clearly. When intimacy is used as a bargaining chip, it is no longer intimacy. It is currency. Healthy partners communicate changes in desire. They talk about stress. They address issues directly. They don't weaponize closeness to win arguments or maintain dominance. In a healthy dynamic, affection is not conditional upon obedience, but in a narcissistic dynamic, conditionality is the rule. You might also notice cycles, periods of cold distance followed by brief returns of warmth. Just enough affection to keep you hopeful, just enough connection to reset your tolerance, and then the withdrawal returns. This inconsistency deepens the trauma bond. You begin living for the moments when they come back. And every time they do, it feels like relief. But relief is not the same as safety. Over time, the cumulative impact of sexual withholding is profound. It erodes self-trust. It erodes confidence. It creates a constant undercurrent of insecurity. You may start performing for approval. You may overextend yourself emotionally. You may tolerate behaviors you once would have questioned, all to avoid that cold silence. And here's the hardest part. Because the withholding is often subtle, it's difficult to explain to others. There are no visible bruises, no explosive fights, just absence, just distance, just a slow erosion of closeness that leaves you feeling unwanted and unsure. So if you find yourself constantly chasing intimacy, constantly adjusting yourself to regain affection, constantly fearing that one wrong move will lead to distance, pause. Ask yourself whether closeness in your relationship feels safe or conditional. Because real intimacy is freely given. It is not dangled like a reward. It is not withdrawn to teach a lesson. It does not disappear when you assert your needs. When someone controls affection to control you, that's not love. That's leverage. And once intimacy has become a tool for power, once love bombing has hooked you and withholding has destabilized you, the next shift can feel even more violating because now we're talking about boundaries. Healthy sexuality is built on consent, respect, and mutual comfort. It involves ongoing conversations, not assumptions. It involves checking in, not pushing through. But in a narcissistic dynamic, boundaries are not always honored. In fact, they're often tested. It may not begin in an obvious way. It can start subtly. A joke that makes you uncomfortable, a suggestion you're not quite okay with, a request framed as playful but carrying pressure underneath it. And when you hesitate, instead of your hesitation being respected, it becomes a challenge. They may say, "Why are you so uptight?" They may say, "If you loved me, you would." They may say, "You're overreacting." And just like that, your boundary is reframed as a flaw in you. This is how coercion often works in narcissistic relationships. It's rarely loud at first. It's persuasive. It's minimizing. It's guilt-inducing. You're made to feel unreasonable for wanting comfort, safety, or pacing. Your no becomes an inconvenience. Your discomfort becomes drama. Over time, that pressure accumulates. You may find yourself agreeing to things you're not fully comfortable with just to avoid conflict, just to avoid withdrawal, just to avoid criticism. And because the narcissistic partner often ties sex to approval and validation, the stakes feel high. If you say no, you risk distance, you risk anger, you risk ridicule. That's not consent. That's fear-based compliance. And here's something that's deeply important to understand. In narcissistic dynamics, boundaries are often experienced as threats. A boundary says, "You do not have unlimited access to me." But narcissism thrives on entitlement. It thrives on the belief that their needs supersede yours. So when you assert a limit, it disrupts that entitlement. The response may be subtle irritation. It may be mockery. It may be sulking. It may even escalate into anger. But the underlying message is the same. Your boundary is inconvenient to me. In healthier relationships, a boundary invites discussion. In narcissistic ones, it invites resistance. There's also a pattern of gradual desensitization that can occur. They may introduce something small that makes you uncomfortable. When you tolerate it, the next request pushes a little further. Each step feels only slightly beyond your comfort zone. But when you look back months later, you realize how far you've drifted from your original standards. That's not coincidence, that's conditioning. And because narcissistic partners are often highly attuned to image, they may present themselves publicly as respectful, progressive, attentive, which makes it even more confusing. You may think, maybe I'm imagining this. Everyone else sees them as charming. That disconnect can make you question your own perception. But your body rarely lies. If you feel tension instead of safety, if you feel pressured instead of desired, if you feel obligated instead of engaged, those sensations matter. Another layer of boundary violation is emotional manipulation tied to sexuality. They may compare you to past partners. They may make subtle comments about what other people would do. They may withhold affection and imply it's because you're not adventurous enough or attractive enough. The goal is not mutual growth. The goal is to create insecurity. Insecurity makes you easier to control. And when insecurity mixes with sexual vulnerability, it can deeply impact self-worth. You may start redefining your limits, not based on your comfort, but based on their approval. You may override your intuition repeatedly. And every time you do, you disconnect a little more from yourself. That disconnection is costly because boundaries are not walls. They are expressions of self-respect. They communicate where you end and someone else begins. When those lines are repeatedly crossed, blurred, or dismissed, your sense of identity begins to erode. In the most severe cases, coercion can escalate into outright disregard for consent. And I want to be clear, entitlement does not excuse violation. Charm does not excuse pressure. Passion does not excuse disrespect. No matter how intense the relationship feels, no matter how much history you share, your boundaries are valid. If someone consistently pushes past them, minimizes them, or punishes you for asserting them, that is not intimacy. That is exploitation wrapped in romance. So pay attention to how your no is received. Pay attention to whether your comfort matters as much as their desire. Pay attention to whether conversations about intimacy feel collaborative or coercive. Because in real connection, your boundaries are not obstacles, they are honored. And if they cannot honor them, they are not seeking closeness, they are seeking control. And when boundaries have been blurred, when consent has been pressured, another pattern becomes clearer. The way sex itself turns into a performance rather than a connection. This is where many people feel confused because on the surface, everything might still look good. The narcissistic partner may appear confident, skilled, assertive. They may even pride themselves on being exceptional in bed, but something essential is missing because what's being prioritized is not connection, it's image. For a narcissistic individual, sex is often another stage, another place to perform, another opportunity to reinforce a carefully constructed identity. desirable, powerful, impressive, superior. They want to be seen a certain way, and sexuality becomes one more arena where that image must be maintained. You may notice how focused they are on how they're perceived. Are they impressive? Are they admired? Are they being validated? Compliments matter, sometimes more than connection itself. Praise becomes currency, and if they don't receive it, you may sense irritation, withdrawal, or subtle resentment. That's because the goal was never mutual pleasure. The goal was affirmation. In healthy intimacy, there's curiosity, there's responsiveness, there's an attunement to the other person's emotional and physical experience. There's a back and forth that feels alive and grounded, but in a performative dynamic, that attunement is shallow. The focus keeps circling back to them, their needs, their desires, their experience. You may find that your pleasure is acknowledged only insofar as it reflects well on them. If you enjoy something, it reinforces their self-image. If you don't, it becomes a threat. Instead of curiosity, what do you need? You may encounter defensiveness or dismissal or subtle blame. And over time, that does something to you. You may start to perform too. You may exaggerate responses. You may hide discomfort. You may silence preferences that don't align with their script. You may feel pressure to react a certain way, not because it feels authentic, but because it keeps the peace, because it maintains their image, because it avoids conflict. That's not intimacy. That's emotional labor. Another sign of performative sexuality is the lack of emotional aftercare. After closeness, there's no soft landing, no checking in, no shared reflection. The moment ends abruptly. You may feel used, even if you can't quite articulate why. The connection doesn't linger, it doesn't deepen, it just stops. And if you bring this up, you may be met with confusion or minimization. What more do you want? Isn't that enough? Those questions reveal the disconnect, because for them, the act itself was the point. The connection was never the goal. Performance also explains why novelty often matters more than depth. New experiences, new dynamics, new ways to feel powerful or impressive, but repetition, familiarity, emotional closeness, those can feel boring or even threatening, because depth requires presence, and presence requires authenticity. Authenticity is risky. So instead of slowing down, instead of deepening, the focus stays on stimulation, on intensity, on proving something. And stimulation can be exciting, but it doesn't nourish, it doesn't build safety, it doesn't create trust. Over time, this dynamic can leave you feeling strangely invisible. Your body is there, your role is there, but you are not fully there. Your inner world remains uninvited. Your emotional experience feels irrelevant, and that invisibility hurts, because sex at its healthiest is one of the few places where we are allowed to be fully seen. Flaws, vulnerability, longing, fear, and all. When that space becomes a performance, it loses its power to heal and connect. There's also a deeper cost here. When you are consistently treated as an audience rather than a partner, your sense of self begins to shift. You may start measuring your worth through their reactions, their approval, their satisfaction. You become responsible for maintaining their experience. That imbalance is exhausting, and it's no accident. Performance-based intimacy keeps the narcissistic system intact. As long as they are admired, validated, and unchallenged, they don't have to confront their own emptiness. Your presence becomes a tool for emotional regulation, not a shared experience. So ask yourself this gently and honestly. In moments of closeness, do you feel connected or evaluated? Do you feel free to be real or pressured to be impressive? Do you feel met or measured? Because real intimacy doesn't feel like an audition. It feels like a meeting. And if sex leaves you feeling like you played a role instead of shared yourself, then what's happening isn't connection. It's performance in the service of someone else's ego. And connection cannot survive where authenticity is not allowed. And after the performance, after the pressure, after the boundaries have been tested and stretched, there is another shift that can be deeply wounding. and that's devaluation through sexual criticism. In the beginning, you may have been idealized, desired intensely, complimented constantly. You may have felt like the most attractive, magnetic person in the room. That early stage can feel intoxicating because it feeds directly into your sense of worth. But when the narcissistic cycle moves from idealization into devaluation, sexuality often becomes one of the first places the shift shows up. The compliments become fewer, the enthusiasm cools, and in its place, subtle critiques begin to emerge. It may start small. A comment about your body, a comparison to someone else, maybe an ex, maybe a celebrity, maybe someone on social media, a suggestion that you used to be more exciting, a casual remark about how you don't initiate enough. Each comment taken alone might seem insignificant, but together they create a pattern, and the pattern chips away at you. Sexual criticism in a narcissistic dynamic isn't about improvement. It isn't about growth or mutual exploration. It's about destabilization. When your confidence weakens, your dependency strengthens. If you begin to doubt your desirability, you may work harder to regain their approval. You may become more compliant, more eager to please, less likely to challenge them. That shift restores their power. What makes this especially painful is the contrast. You remember how desired you once felt. You remember the intensity, and now, instead of being uplifted, you're being evaluated. Instead of being celebrated, you're being measured. You may start scrutinizing yourself in the mirror, comparing yourself to others, questioning whether you're attractive enough, adventurous enough, responsive enough. You may internalize their shifting behavior as evidence that something is wrong with you. But let's pause here. In healthy intimacy, feedback is collaborative and kind. It's rooted in care. It never attacks someone's core worth. In a narcissistic dynamic, criticism often targets identity, your body, your age, your sexuality, your desirability, the very areas that are most vulnerable. And because sexuality is so personal, those criticisms land deeply. There's also a moving target element to this. What pleased them once may suddenly be insufficient. What was praised last year may be criticized now. The standards change, but the dissatisfaction remains. That inconsistency keeps you striving. It keeps you anxious. It keeps you focused on fixing yourself rather than questioning the dynamic. Sometimes the criticism is direct. Other times it's more insidious. Withdrawal paired with implication. They may become less affectionate and then hint that you're not as appealing as before. They may consume attention elsewhere, flirting, commenting, comparing, and let you feel the competition without saying it outright. That's not accidental. It's destabilizing by design. Over time, this pattern erodes sexual confidence. You may begin to approach intimacy with anxiety instead of excitement. Instead of feeling free, you feel self-conscious. Instead of being present, you're monitoring yourself, your body, your reactions, your performance. And when anxiety enters the bedroom, connection disappears. The tragedy here is that many people blame themselves. They think, if I just improved, if I just tried harder, if I just looked different. But the devaluation phase of narcissism is not about your inadequacy. It's about their need for superiority. When someone needs to feel bigger, someone else has to feel smaller. Sexual criticism becomes a way to shrink you, to reduce your sense of worth just enough that you don't leave, just enough that you keep seeking their validation, just enough that you forget what confident desire used to feel like. And here's something important. Confident, secure partners do not need to undermine you to feel powerful. They are not threatened by your self-esteem. They are not invested in keeping you uncertain. If your sexual self-esteem has steadily declined in the relationship, if you feel more anxious now than you did before you met them, if intimacy feels like evaluation rather than connection, that's not a personal failing. That's a relational pattern. The goal of devaluation is to destabilize your identity so thoroughly that you question your own worth instead of questioning their behavior. but you are not defined by someone else's shifting approval. Your desirability does not rise and fall based on their mood. Your body is not a bargaining chip. Your sexuality is not a performance review. When intimacy becomes a place of criticism instead of safety, something fundamental has been broken, because real connection builds you up. It does not slowly tear you down. And if someone can only feel powerful by diminishing you, then what they're protecting isn't love. It's their own fragile ego. And when you step back and look at all of it, the power plays, the love bombing, the withholding, the boundary violations, the performance, the criticism, what you begin to see is not random behavior. It's a cycle, a deeply conditioning cycle. And at the center of that cycle is something incredibly powerful: trauma bonding. Trauma bonding doesn't happen because you're weak. It happens because you're human. When someone alternates between intense closeness and painful distance, your nervous system gets pulled into a loop. The early passion created a high, the withdrawal created anxiety, the criticism created insecurity, and then just when you feel like you can't take it anymore, they give you a glimpse of the person you first met. A warm night, a moment of passion, a compliment, a sudden softness, and your whole body exhales. That relief is what bonds you, because your brain starts associating them not only with pain, but with the relief from pain. And that's a powerful reinforcement system. It's the same psychological principle that keeps people stuck in unpredictable reward cycles. When the good moments are inconsistent, they become more valuable. You chase them. You long for them. You believe that if you just get it right, the good version will return permanently. But it never stabilizes. The push-pull dynamic is not accidental. It keeps you emotionally off balance. When things are good, they feel incredibly good, almost magical. When they're bad, they feel devastating. And the contrast between those two extremes creates intensity that can be mistaken for love. Intensity is not love. Stability is love. Safety is love. Consistency is love. But when you've been conditioned through cycles of idealization and devaluation, your internal compass can get scrambled. Calm starts to feel boring. Predictability starts to feel unfamiliar. You may even find yourself craving the drama because your nervous system has adapted to chaos. That's trauma bonding at work. It can also create cognitive dissonance. You hold two conflicting truths at once. They hurt me deeply, and they are the only one who makes me feel this alive. Your mind tries to reconcile those contradictions. You minimize the harm. You magnify the good. You tell yourself that every relationship has ups and downs. But deep down, your body knows the difference between ups and downs and emotional whiplash. Trauma bonding also feeds on hope. Hope that the beginning will come back. Hope that if you love them enough, support them enough, fix yourself enough, things will stabilize. That hope keeps you invested long after the relationship has begun eroding your self-esteem. And because sexuality was woven into every stage of the cycle, the love bombing, the withholding, the criticism, the bond becomes even stronger. Physical intimacy activates attachment systems in the brain. When those systems are repeatedly activated and disrupted, the bond can feel almost addictive. You may leave and feel withdrawal. You may try to detach and feel intense cravings to reconnect. You may intellectually understand the harm, but emotionally feel pulled back in. That doesn't mean you're broken. It means your nervous system was conditioned. The most painful part of trauma bonding is that it makes you doubt yourself. You may ask, if it was so bad, why do I still miss them? Because you're not just missing the person. You're missing the relief, the highs, the moments of intensity that felt like proof of connection. But here's the truth. A relationship that requires pain to make the pleasure feel meaningful is not a healthy bond. Healthy love does not depend on contrast to feel powerful. It doesn't require you to endure criticism to earn affection. It doesn't oscillate between worship and rejection. If you find yourself stuck in the loop, longing, hoping, rationalizing, pause and ask, does this relationship feel steady Or does it feel like a roller coaster I can't get off? Because trauma bonds thrive on unpredictability. They weaken in the presence of clarity. When you begin to name the pattern and when you see the cycle for what it is, the fog starts to lift. You stop chasing the highs. You stop internalizing the lows. You start reclaiming your sense of self outside the push-pull dynamic. And that's where healing begins. Not in waiting for them to change, not in trying to win back the early intensity, but in recognizing that love should not feel like survival. If a relationship repeatedly breaks you and then briefly soothes you, that's not passion. That's conditioning. And the moment you see the cycle clearly is the moment you begin to break it.